President Biden is already selling his infrastructure package now that it's passed in the Senate. He held a virtual roundtable with local leaders yesterday discussing the bipartisan $1 trillion bill. The House still needs to approve it, but the president said the investment will benefit the country for years to come.
It's going to create literally millions of jobs, good paying jobs, putting America on a path to win the 21st century global economy. And we're in competition with many other nations.
Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. was one of those local leaders at the roundtable yesterday and is here with us now. He's the chief of the Cherokee Nation. Thank you so much for joining us, Chief. You spoke a lot yesterday about the impact of broadband, and we know there's a major investment in broadband in this package. It's something that you noticed in particular once the pandemic hit, how much people within the Cherokee Nation needed proper broadband, needed access to the internet. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that the Cherokee Nation faces in regards to this?
Sure, and it's true across Indian country. The gaps in broadband, some places it's just not there, something many Americans may take for granted. And that was true in the Cherokee Nation reservation. It became really laid bare when we got into this worst public health crisis in living memory, in which people are isolating, which kids are having to change how they learn and learn virtually, in which elders are needing to access our health system through telemedicine, in which we're having to do things in a way that accommodate the necessary isolation that we have to have when the pandemic hits its various peaks. And so what we found was the gaps that were there were all the more apparent. And so you have Cherokee kids not able to access virtual learning. You have those elders not able to make those telemedicine appointments. And then we're in the midst of, at Cherokee Nation, of saving our language. We only have about 2,000 fluent speakers left. And a big part of that is connecting elders that live in these communities where Cherokee is still spoken to a generation of young Cherokees who want to learn. Very difficult to do that safely in the midst of COVID. And then when you can't lean on the technology and the broadband connectivity, it becomes a real crisis for the Cherokee people because we have to save our language and culture. It's really an existential threat to our people. So this infrastructure bill pumps $2 billion into a program that will help all of Indian country. And that's, of course, in a much larger package of $11 billion for Indian country. So we're going to be able to scale up some of the programs that we've implemented already at the Cherokee Nation. But we have to close these gaps because in 2021, no one in the United States needs to be without access to the rest of the world, streams of commerce, medicine, connecting with family and friends in the rest of the world. It just shouldn't happen, and it sure shouldn't happen in Indian country. And we've got a big opportunity here if this bill becomes law.
So speaking of some of the initiatives you've already implemented that this bill would bolster, the Cherokee Nation recently became the first tribe to reach an agreement with the Department of Transportation, allowing more control over road repairs. How does this infrastructure package and the forthcoming money impact that?
Well, it injects a great deal of money, and we're looking at over $3 billion in transportation infrastructure for Indian country, at places where roads are still gravel roads and not very good gravel roads, and bridges need to be replaced for safety so school buses can run up and down them. Little communities that we need to save because they're communities where, again, it's not only about the economy, although that's important, but these are also communities where our language and culture still thrives. We have to keep those communities alive. And so our ability to do that, both with this additional funding and the ability to be respected as sovereign nations, to be able to craft road programs in the way that are best suited to our local conditions, that's important. That's what that self-governance piece that was announced recently is about. So we're at a time in history, I think, where tribes are at the table more than we had previously. I mean, I think about my grandfather's generation. He probably wouldn't have imagined his grandson would be chief of the Cherokee Nation, let alone engaging with the President of the United States on funding for things that are so important, like water, like roads. And of course, broadband wasn't part of his life, but he certainly understood the need to stay connected with friends and neighbors. So I think about where we are right now, and I think it's a good position for Indian country. We have to keep pushing. This bill needs to become law. And I'm so glad it's on a bipartisan basis, because in Indian country, you know, we look for solutions from friends on both sides of the aisle. That's what's so appealing about this bill, is it's a bipartisan bill.
I want to ask you about a few other things now that I have you here. We talked about the pandemic and how that really, for every community, sort of put a spotlight on some of the challenges. The Cherokee Nation has seen a steep rise in COVID-19 hospitalizations recently. How is the Cherokee Nation fighting the virus, and what can you tell us about the vaccination efforts?
Well, it's our most difficult and pressing fight right now is COVID. The spread is rampant. The virus, the variant is very dangerous. Our vaccination effort within our government workforce has been very successful. We introduced an incentive program and got our government workforce, which is thousands of people, thousands of Cherokees, up to over 70%, which is kind of the minimum threshold you want to get. But sadly, in the region, this includes Cherokees and non-Cherokees, the vaccination rate is still far too low. It's still, depending on the county, and we cover about 14 counties, it's still in the 30s. And so vaccination is far too low. I don't hear near enough in the state of Oklahoma in terms of vaccine promotion from the highest ranks of state government. We're trying our best at Cherokee Nation to reach out and make the vaccine available to everyone, but it's really daunting challenge. And we literally have the ability to save lives and stem misery. Each of us has that if we'll take the vaccine. Not enough of us are taking it. So we're having to curtail activities. We have an annual event that's a great celebration for the Cherokee people, the Cherokee National Holiday. We just recently decided to make that substantially all virtual. Our classrooms, we live in a state in which the state of Oklahoma has outlawed mask mandates for schools, which makes zero sense in terms of public health. We're not under those misguided laws, but we are having a very safe school environment in which people wear masks, they get tested, vaccines required for certain activities at the school. So we're trying to create a safe environment, but we don't live on an island. It's a very dangerous time for the Cherokee people. And again, it's a threat to our health, threat to our economy, and it's also threatening those elders who have that language and those life ways in their hearts and in their minds. And that worries me every day.
Chief, before we let you go, the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, announced the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, and I know she's called on an investigation into Indian boarding schools, similar to what we see north of the border in Canada. I want to get your take on this. Why is this important for the country to look into this particularly dark chapter?
Well, it's very important, and people that follow the news coming out of Canada saw the great tragedy, just hundreds and hundreds of little boys and girls that were cast away in mass graves in this boarding school. People in the country ought to know that this all stems from a federal Indian policy that was about civilizing, supposedly, Native Americans. And the saying used by the promoters at the time in the 19th century was kill the Indian, save the man, literally kill the culture. And they did. And in many ways, they not only figuratively beat the language out of young people, they physically at times beat the language out of young people, along with culture and lifeways. That policy did immeasurable injury to tribes across the country, injury that we're still feeling today, not only emotionally, but in very real terms, in terms of loss of culture and language, and then the other impacts it has when you lose a substantial part of a generation to that kind of policy. So I think the United States needs to look back critically at that policy. We need to investigate if there are, in fact, the mass graves that were discovered in Canada. At Cherokee Nation, we've actually acquired some former boarding schools, or a former boarding school. We'll continue to look across our reservation. And we're not only going to look critically and sort of force the question, but we're also going to chart new chapters for these properties so that they're truly places of joy and hope for the future. We at Cherokee Nation had some good relations with local boarding schools, but nationally, it is something that the country has to look at critically. And that's why I think we're at this point in the history of this country that we can do so. And I'm glad we're doing it. I applaud Secretary Haaland for doing it.
Chief Hoskin, thank you so much.
Thanks.